Welcome to Sanguine Daring and Mars Trialogue. My name is Whitney, and I'm so excited to be here today with Jessica and Caleb. The order of operations today is just going to be each of us presenting one after the other. We're going to start with me talking about martial archetypes, then hand over to Caleb to talk about Mars' synodic cycle, and then to Jessica to talk about the upcoming retrograde. So each of us will be speaking about 15 to 20 minutes, and there will be a Q&A at the end. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. I want to go over a quick Zoom courtesy. If you can all kindly keep yourself muted, I think you're obliged to right now. But if you do come off at one point, go ahead and mute yourself again, just so that we can make sure everyone can hear the presentation. It is Mercury retrograde, so if you can all kindly help us to navigate that by keeping chat comments to a minimum. We know it's really exciting to make connections in the course of a presentation, but we're looking out for questions and concerns, like if somebody can't hear the presenter in the chat. So if you do feel inspired or you make a connection, we'd love to see you share that on social media or on your blog and tag the presenter who inspired it. With that being said, again, we will do questions at the very end to make sure that each of the three presenters can get through the material. The questions, we're asking that those can be generalized to support everyone's learning. So please, no specific questions about natal charts that would be better answered in a consultation. And then because this is Mars, we're asking if folks can use content warnings if that's needed. And then lastly, we have a few charities that we wanted to highlight. If you do have the means, we welcome you to support one of those. We have Nimiapoo Protecting the Environment. We have the Native American Disability Law Center and Mutual Aid Disaster Relief. So Jessica, Caleb, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so yesterday was Native American Heritage Day. I chose Nimipu Protecting the Environment because it is, Nimipu is the name meaning the people that the Nez Perce tribe refers to themselves as. And Nimipu Protecting the Environment is a group of Nez Perce tribal members focused on, well, I was thinking with like Mars and Cancer, right? That's the bulk of this retrograde, what it's going to be about. So I was thinking about, protecting waterways, protecting watersheds, and a big part of their organization's efforts is focused on the Snake River, which is one of the biggest watersheds here in the Cascadia region. And, there's a lot of contentious issues regarding to rivers and dams being put up and the way that blocks certain salmon runs and affects the environment. With that being like a big part of what they do, I suggest people, for remediating Mars and Cancer, donate to that organization or, focus planetary remediation in that way, because there's also other remediatory things happening there.
Yeah, and likewise, I chose Native American Disability Law Center. This is an organization that is not specifically aligned, I guess, with this retrograde period, but is representative, I think, of Mars in my own chart. I have Mars in the 6th house, ruling the 4th. So it felt like an appropriate organization that's along those symbolic lines.
And then I chose Mutual Aid Disaster Relief because there's obviously quite a bit going on in the world these days where Mars type events, wildfires or desertification or just, extreme events are causing people to lose homes and livelihoods. Mutual Aid Disaster Relief focuses on a solidarity approach to mutual aid, and they do a lot to support those who are more marginalized. So if, again, you have the means and the inclination to do so, we'd love to support these causes. So with all that said, let's go ahead and kick off with a discussion of martial archetypes and orient ourselves to working with Mars. Again, my name is Whitney Hill, and I've been studying and practicing Hellenistic astrology for almost 6 years now, so since 2019. I'm a Cancer rising with Mars in Aries in the 10th house, so of course I had to bring in the classical delineation and become a blacksmith as well. I'm also studying for a master's in cultural astronomy and astrology. I'm an author, I do marketing, so these are some things that you'll see come out in my work. If you would like to tag me in anything, I'm on Instagram and Threads as Cobra and Crescent, Blue Sky now as well. I'm not so much on Twitter anymore, but Cobra_Crescent. I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes about who Mars is and assessing Mars and some thoughts on working with Mars. You're welcome to live tweet anything you see, but just please tag me. And before we get started, just a reminder to pace yourself. So again, like this is Mars, it covers a lot of difficult and potentially uncomfortable topics. I'm not planning to delve into those very deeply, but just as a reminder, if you do need to step away, please go ahead and do that. Like Saturn, Mars can be a planet of extremes and too muchness in a way that can be, kind of fast or acute. So nobody will feel bad if you need to step away and take care of your nervous system and your heart. So who is Mars? While we all may have our own personal experiences, interpretations, and gnosis, there's some basics that define any given planet. And as we prepare to go into this Leo Cancer retrograde, it's worth going back to basics to see how the martial archetype might play through, this cycle. So in Hellenistic and medieval Islamic astrology, Mars is considered a malefic. And there's no value judgment attached to that. It's not bad, it's not evil. It's more about asking the question, is this conducive to life? As we look at Mars, excessive heat and dryness can, suck needed moisture out of life. And it can also drive passionate behavior, which, as Ali Lomi has said, that word passion used to be taken with a more negative connotation than it is now. So it can be, again, that sense of excess. So as we think about Mars, thinking about heat in the sense of not just fire and burning, but also inflammation, fever, hot tempers, or professions using heat and things that must be heated. So chefs or blacksmiths are some different ways that we might see the martial come through. But again, we can also see it in how we treat the world, with climate change, heat waves, ocean warming. And there we see that kind of sense of the martial excess not really being conducive to life. Mars is also about dryness. So dryness as in drought, as in irritation and itchiness. But if we think about it conceptually, it's about separation. For things to come together, they really need to have moisture. They need to have something binding them. They need kind of a Venusian sense of connectivity and connectedness. And we don't have that with Mars. So we might see greater separation when we think about the martial. Mars is also sharpness. So sharp as in edged tools and the work that's done with them, like surgery and butchery. It can be things like slicing, cutting, penetrating, or severing, and the fallout of sharps, like blood. But if we think about it, again, conceptually, it could also be the sense of something acute or fast or sudden. Mars is also action. So action not only is in movement, but also in decisiveness and conviction, making that decision to take an action or having the courage to step forward and act with conviction. And this might be more particular for the fire Mars placements, but this idea of being equals doing. What you do is what you are. And that can kind of bleed into our work in a way that can potentially drive burnout or overwork if we're not careful. So with these different aspects of martial nature, we're looking at how those are tempered, modified, or exacerbated in a chart. And I'm speaking particularly about natal charts here. And you'll see on the screen that I have potentially constructive and potentially destructive, because I think there's two faces to any planet. And I say potentially here because you can have too much of either. But if we're looking at things like, assertion or aggression, these can be two sides of the same coin. So looking at how, again, the factors of the natal chart are encouraging one expression over another and how we might want to address that as Mars goes through different signs or goes into retrograde is always going to be a key part of working with Mars. And a quick note on self-sovereignty in particular, just remembering that the sun exalts in the sign of Mars in Aries, and that the planet Aldebaran is of the nature of Mars. And for me, sovereignty is a key part of integrity. So as we're thinking about, what does it look like to have self-sovereignty or to act with sovereignty, particularly perhaps in the Leo section of the transit, that'll be a place to explore maybe different approaches to Mars. So who Mars is not? Mars is not an excuse for bad behavior. And I say that again as someone with Mars and Aries on the 10th. There are quite a few things that I've gotten into. I can't blame Mars for those things. And I know it's a thing that we do in the astrological community where we say, oh, I'm like that because of, this placement. Or we look at someone else, sometimes negatively, and say, oh, well, that's why they're like that. And I understand that we do that as astrological shorthand. We're all professionals in a field together. We have a way of speaking. But I have concerns that we don't always consider the abdication of responsibility that those kind of statements can entail. So as we're talking about Mars and we're thinking about the way it impacts us and others, I do want to encourage that thinking around, am I being responsible about how I approach this powerful energy that is Mars? There's also a saying that the stars incline, they do not compel, which I've explored in an essay comparing Valens and Abu Mashar. But the gist of it is that astrology offers a gift to assess, understand, and direct our inclinations, and that includes the martial. Just because it has a possibility to manifest as too much heat, too much dryness, too much sharpness, too much action, that does not mean that we are forced to act towards those extremes. So let's look at assessing Mars, because base planetary nature is always going to be heavily influenced and modified by the circumstances it is found in. There's kind of a lot here, but the point is that deeper assessments are adding nuance to any chart, but again, I'm speaking specifically to natal charts here. So while we're investigating, we want to think about those investigative questions. Who, what, when, where, and why. The when part obviously comes in via timing and activation, but the why will be a blend of all of these. So as we're looking at Mars, we can look by sign and say, who is this Mars? We can look by aspect and say, what is Mars interacting with and how? Or if you have a more relational approach, who is Mars interacting with? And we can look by place or by house. Where is Mars acting? And you'll see that I have some things in blue on there. Those are a little bit more advanced. They're not really necessary to having like a good basic understanding, but they're things that I find add a lot of that underlying nuance. And you'll notice also that the Dodecatomori and a lot of courage are listed under all three of them. And that's because as we're like digging down into those deeper layers, we can look at different things related to those points. So as we're looking at sign, does the Dodecatomori of Mars gain or lose dignity? Are these underlying actions supported? We can look at aspect. Can Mars see those points? We can look at place. How is Mars's natal placement being changed or modified by, for example, the Dodecatomori? And then with fixed stars, just because everybody always asks about orbs with fixed stars, I use very tight ones, usually no more than 2 degrees. If you don't already know whether or not you have a fixed star in Peron with Mars, you can check astro.com. So pulling all that together, the big question as you approach Mars in your life and for this upcoming Leo Cancer retrograde is, what does this Mars want to do? So let's talk about working with Mars. And this is when the timing aspect that when we mentioned before is going to be key. So thinking about activation as a major factor is going to help figure out if you even really need to worry about this retrograde, because I know that like astrologers start talking about, oh, such and such planet is going retrograde, and then everybody on social media goes, oh no, what's going to happen? And a lot of times that's not even something that an individual personally needs to worry about. So following Abu Mashar, we want to consider the root, which is the natal chart, speaking to the possibilities encompassed within an individual's life. We want to look at the perfection or the terminal point and say, what is the major focus for this year? And if you want to break it down further by month. And then the revolution, the solar return, and say how those possibilities are modified with each slice of year of life. So thinking about the root, is Mars prominent in your chart generally? Again, mine is in the 10th house. It's always there. If you have it in a cadent house or a house that's not aspecting the ascendant by a traditional aspect, it might not be so prominent for you and appear in other ways. Is it being activated by perfection and any fixed stars being activated with it? And then thinking also about how the condition is changing in the solar return. So with all of this in mind, pulling it together, how, if at all, is Mars being activated in your natal chart during this upcoming retrograde from Leo to Cancer in December 2024 to February 2025? Taking it further, if you have a birthday during that period, is there a shift in focus toward or away from Mars? The retrograde is so, it's not a Mercury retrograde. It's not 3 weeks, it's a few months. So if you have a birthday in that time, you may find that the importance of the retrograde shifts. Also checking to see if Mars is activated at any monthly returns or as master of the revolution for that given solar return. So again, thinking about, those investigative questions and seeing, is Mars even something you need to worry about, can help be a way to manage the approach to the upcoming retrograde. So if there's any planet that can consciously or can benefit from consciously being given a job, in my opinion, it is Mars. And that is one way that I like to look at dealing with difficult transits. I'm going to say, take all of this with a grain of salt. It is something that needs to be approached on a case-by-case and personal basis. If you're not, really familiar with a martial, it can help to engage with an astrologer who is, and especially an astrologer who does your mediation. But that being said, these are some kind of high-level ideas to get started with. So channel the martial. Mars likes to do certain things. Those are generally related to something that is hot, dry, sharp, or active, as I started with. Looking at strengths. So this is a planet where it can be beneficial to focus on strengths rather than trying to grind away and improve weaknesses. There's probably less patience with a Mars placement than there is with other placements like Saturn, and forcing, this improvement of something that you're maybe not great at or that you don't enjoy can bring out potentially some of those more difficult consequences of heat, dryness, sharpness, and action. So think about if you're, really slogging away at something and you're not getting anywhere, and that can lead to a form of burnout. That's not something that we want. So setting limits is going to be another key part of navigating Mars and working with the martial. And how you do that is going to be dependent on your Mars. Venus is the usual recommendation, bringing the Venusian into your life, just because it is the lesser benefic, the other half of the pair of the lesser malefic and benefic. Personally, I prefer to balance my Mars with my Pisces Jupiter just because of what's going on in my natal chart. And this is why, again, it's important to, if you're not, already familiar and comfortable with your chart, it's important to have those conversations with an astrologer who is and who's familiar with remediation. I am just going to leave remediate and mitigate there because it is such a personal thing, chart by chart, and I don't want to offer somebody advice that may not fit with their chart. But there are definitely astrologers who are very experienced in offering that advice. Another piece of advice I have is to know your Mars's troublemakers. So Mars isn't in a vacuum in the natal chart. The ruler of the sign it's in or the planets it's aspecting also have an influence here. This is not it's not an exhaustive list. It's not meant to be taken completely seriously. I'm trying to have a little bit of fun here. But it's a few examples of how to think about planets influencing Mars. Based on delineations from Firmicus and Valens. So understanding those influences on Mars, not only in the natal chart, but also in the solar return chart, can help figure out how that energy might be expressed and where there might be pitfalls. It could look something like this, or it could look the opposite, because again, we're going into a retrograde. So when Mars is in retrograde, consider the root nature of your Mars, and then consider what that might look like when it's reversed, or when it's under stress, or when it's in an unfamiliar situation. So I'm going to touch really briefly on the Leo Cancer retrograde, very broadly and archetypally, because Jessica's presentation is going to have so many more specifics for you and go much deeper on the particular cycle. But one thing we can look at is thinking about the themes. And Mars as potentially a warrior archetype doing battle in the places of the sky's sovereigns, where Leo can be about, pride in oneself, spotlights, or this kind of steady focused intensity, and Cancer's, leaning more toward caring for oneself and provisions. And this can be like more of a nurturing kind of thing. But that does not have to mean mothering. I just want to put that out there. But also thinking about reflections, how we reflect on ourselves and others, and then initiating change. So thinking about how the retrograde can impact those ideas, and also bring in the considerations of the Aries and Scorpio parts of your chart into the Leo and Cancer areas. Part of this retrograde will be looking for places of excess pain or inflammation. So we often look at Jupiter as a planet of, too much when it goes out of control, or it's, having difficulty in the chart. But harmful excess can really be a hallmark of malefics. And we think about heat and pain and inflammation, maybe potentially, especially in the body, or in the mind or in the emotions, that can be an indicator that something's not right. So taking a minute to pause and taking advantage of the retrograde to say, where am I getting heated? Where am I experiencing inflamed passions? Thinking about where you may be experiencing discomfort. Thinking about where you're feeling hurt, especially to your pride for Leo, to your feelings, or to your body for Cancer. And then also thinking about where you're feeling exhausted, resentful, or overdrawn from doing too much. Because again, we're looking at the places of the sky's sovereigns. And what do sovereigns do? They manage, they direct, they rule. And when we're put Mars in the position of doing those things, and we put that kind of nature of action there, we can find ourselves doing too much. So it could be a good time to consider what benefits from being reduced in your life, what benefits from being separated from your life, what benefits from being cauterized, heated and sealed. What would benefit from being melted down and used in a different way to a different purpose? Or what would benefit from being lanced to allow some poisons to drain? Or we can say a little bit more constructively, look at ways to evaluate your sovereignty, exercise your courage, practice assertiveness, review decisions, or assess whether the actions you've been taking are the correct ones, using the correct amount of effort or force. And that goes for both strong Mars and Mars in more challenging positions. The stronger Mars might need to say, "Ooh, I've been going a little bit too hard." A more challenged Mars might be able to say, "Ooh, I haven't been using my effort in the correct way or in a way that benefits me rather than burning me out." Or we could just do less. Mars retrograde might just mean that there's no more gas in the tank. If the natural action of this planet is doing or moving or action, the retrograde might have to be about not doing. So take this as permission to do less. But also consider people who are indicated by Mars, because again, it may not be you who is affected by any given Mars transit, whether Mars is direct or retrograde. It may well be somebody who has a profession indicated by Mars, or somebody who is represented by the house that Mars rules in your chart, or a martial person who just has that kind of aspect in your life. Could be body parts ruled by Leo and Cancer. Could be topics of derived houses that come up. I particularly like looking at the houses derived from fortune. So for example, the last Mars in Leo transit we had, that is my 6th house from fortune. I got bit by fire ants all over. So it may not be quite so literal. But if you're struggling to see where Mars is coming through in your natal chart, those derived houses can definitely be a place to look. So to wrap up, preparing for that upcoming retrograde starts with, investigating the Martial in your life, in your natal chart, understanding how those Martial characteristics are modified or how they're expressed for you in your life. Always remember that there are multiple ways that things can play out. Sometimes we need the more challenging things that Mars offers to fight our way through a difficult time. And sometimes we need to tell Mars to just, put the sword down for a little bit and take a nap. So however Mars is coming through for you, I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you so much for your attention. If you would like to talk more about Mars in your natal chart, I do have a special reading for it. People who have attended this talk can use discount code Sanguine through December 14th to get 20% off. You can also sign up for my newsletter to get monthly transit notes, or if you're looking to do more in-depth learning, I offer some articles in my IBIS Nest. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Caleb.
Cool. Thank you so much, Whitney. Give me a second to share my screen. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for illustrating, in broad strokes, Mars's archetypal nature. What I'm going to do here is talk more about Mars's synodic cycle with the sun. This talk was originally given to the Portland astrology group run by Nicholas Palomenakis around the Kazemi last year. So shout out to him, as well as Devin Malone, who helped give some feedback after that initial delivery to edit and refine this presentation. So just to forewarn you, this is actually going to be more astronomical than astrological in nature. However, I think, those two sciences, arts, so to speak, were once indistinguishable. And I think all of us astrologers would benefit from having a clearer understanding of astronomy, because there's a lot that happens symbolically, astronomically, that can inform what also takes place astrologically. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself first. For those who don't know me, my name's Caleb McCoy. I started studying astrology, Hellenistic astrology in earnest, really back in 2018. In 2020, I decided to pursue formal certification with Adam Ellenboss's Nightlight Astrology School. And I did his year one program and finished in 21. I do have a BA in philosophy, and I think that greatly influences how I approach astrology. And in addition to doing astrology, I'm also a dad. I teach full-time. I'm a drummer and a poet, and also a heavy metal enthusiast, right? My platform is a marriage of some of those great loves, right? And my own Mars placement is, we're on the opposite side of the zodiac from Whitney. I have Mars in Libra, conjunct Spica and Arcturus. And there's my socials and my website if you want to follow me. All right, so what even is a synodic cycle, right? A synodic cycle is the relationship between two different celestial bodies when observed from our vantage point on Earth. And it's not just, the sun and any given planet. It can be any number of planets and their relationships to each other. So much of our job as astrologers is to examine and qualify and explain relationships between ourselves, between the planets and the Earth, right? The sort of prototypical, I think, synodic cycle would be the moon and the sun, the lunar month, which we all know relatively well. It's one of the easiest ones you can learn coming into astrology, and is quite visibly evident over the period of 29.5 days that it lasts. But today we'll be talking about the synodic cycle, or the relationship between Mars and the sun. And why, right? Why bother? And to some degree, I think it's just a good matter of timing. Recently, this past Wednesday, Mars formed a superior trine to the sun, and that is a moment in Mars's synodic cycle that indicates that Mars is about to station retrograde. This is true of any superior planet. But there are additional bits about Mars's synodic cycle that I find really interesting, that I think makes it unique when compared against both the inner planets of Mercury and Venus, as well as other superior planets such as Jupiter and Saturn. So Mars actually has the longest solar synodic period. You can see there's a chart on the right-hand side that shows the number of days for each planet's, the classical planets, their solar synodic periods, with Mars's being the longest. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that Mars has a highly eccentric orbit, and the third most elliptical orbit after both Pluto and Mercury. It also has there's Mars's proximity to Earth, right? It's one of our closest neighbors. And also there's a big influence from Jupiter's massive gravity well that also affects Mars's orbit. That's one reason why Mars's orbit is so elliptical in shape. So as a result, the synodic period, due to the eccentricity and ellipticality of Mars's orbit, the length can vary anywhere from 762 days to 819 days, but the average is 780, and the present cycle we're in is more of the average variety in that it is lasting, or will last, 785 days. And here is an animation that shows the at least like ovular shape of Mars's orbit when compared against the more circular, like neat and circular ones that Earth and Venus make. This doesn't necessarily show the eccentricity of Mars's orbit, meaning that it actually is at an angle to the orbital plane when compared against Earth's orbit around the sun. So rather than being all the planets being on like a flat line together, Mars is slightly askew, right? And then Pluto is similarly askew, but even more so. And you can make of that what you want astrologically. So I want to go through just blow by blow the important moments in Mars's synodic cycle, and this portion is greatly dependent upon Robert Blaschke's book, Astrology, A Language of Life, Volume 5, Holographic Transits. He has a diagram in here that I'm essentially adapting and have altered a bit so that one can understand the way this plays out over, I said Mars's synodic cycle is 780 days roughly. That's about 2.1 years. So we're going to look at what happens over the course of those 2.1 years, those 25 to 26 months. And we're going to start with the Mars-Sun conjunction. That's the beginning of the cycle. Looking at the circular diagram on the right, consider that to be essentially the zodiac, and we're going to look at Mars's position relative to the Sun as the two of them move around the zodiac. So the new moon moment happens as the first moment in the cycle. This is the seeding point. The most recent one happened on November 17th last year when we got the cazimi at 25 degrees of Scorpio. The subsequent moment in the cycle that's worth recognizing is Mars's heliacal rise, or phasis. Phasis is a Greek term which means an appearance or saying. Manetho remarks that all the stars rejoice when they are at their rising, just as each is exalted in its own rulerships. Being on the rise, as it were, unto their youth, being quite powerful, they accomplish all things for men. The heliacal rise of a planet is important insofar as it's the moment when it is no longer invisible, right? The conjunction moment happens when Mars is under the beams of the sun, but once it hits at about 10 or 11 degrees away from the sun, then it becomes visible again. And the time that Mars spends invisible is longer than any other planet due to some of the factors we talked about earlier. Like if you think about the fact that the cazimi happened at 25 Scorpio, and it wasn't until it was, 38 degrees deeper into the zodiac at 3 degrees of Capricorn that it actually became visible and rose again, became visible as a morning star. This is Mars as oriental, visible before the sun rises. So it happens a solid month and a half after the conjunction. At this point, then we can move on to the waxing square. You can think of this as analogous to when we get the first quarter moon in the lunar cycle. And this ends the first quadrant of Mars's cycle, which lasts on average 283 days. So at this point, Mars is 90 degrees away or relative to the sun. And this always occurs when Mars enters its pre-retrograde shadow. So the most recent one fell on October 14th when Mars hit 21 degrees of Cancer, and it had entered its shadow period only 10 days prior on the 4th when it hit 17 degrees of Cancer. This, part of Mars's cycle, it's becoming visible for a longer period earlier in the morning at dawn, but we're getting closer to Mars's station date at this point. This is where we're at now in the cycle. We just hit the waxing trine only several days ago on Wednesday when Mars hit 5 degrees of Leo. And like I said, of all superior planets, this is true. We get the waxing trine in the cycle. It occurs around the time that the planet is due to station retrograde, right? So the retrograde station is happening in 6 days, I believe. But the trine happened, only a few days prior to this. It's not exact, but when you see Mars and the Sun making these aspects, you can know where you're at in terms of the overall cycle. The next stop in the cycle is the Mars-Sun opposition. This is the full moon moment. It ends the second quadrant of Mars's cycle, which lasts only roughly 106 days. This is halfway through the retrograde period and halfway through the cycle in general. At this point, Mars transitions to being an evening star, and in general, Mars is visible right after sunset and visible for the longest amount of time. It is also the point in Mars's cycle when it is closest to the Earth and therefore most apparent. It appears closest and it appears brightest. And if you're interested in just astronomical observation, this is the best time to go out and look at Mars. This opposition, the next opposition will occur on January 16th at 26 degrees of Cancer. And I will talk more about the opposition later on in the talk. Next, you have the waning trine, which occurs around the time that Mars stations direct. The next one will happen March 8th at 17 Cancer, although Mars will have technically stationed 2 weeks prior to this on February 23rd. But that's when you get the exact aspect. The next is the waning square. This ends the third quadrant of Mars's cycle. At this point, Mars is solidly an evening star, but is declining in terms of the amount of time that it is visible at night. This also ends that 105-day quadrant that you can measure from the opposition to this square, and it occurs around the time that Mars exits its pre-retrograde shadow. And you'll notice that the next one, April 20th, when Mars is at 0 degrees of Leo, is also when we get the third of the 3 Pluto-Mars trines, which are coloring this upcoming retrograde. Last, we have the heliacal set, which mirrors the heliacal rise. Mars becomes invisible as an evening star when 10 to 11 degrees away from the sun. That will happen roughly a year from now when Mars has its evening set at 6 degrees of Sagittarius. And just to show you what the start of the next one looks like, there will be a Mars-Sun conjunction in January of 2026 at 19 degrees of Capricorn, and that will end the fourth quadrant of Mars cycle, which starts at the waning square and lasts roughly 285 days. So I hope that gives like a good illustration of just how that cycle plays out along the zodiac. There are a couple peculiarities as well about Mars's cycle that I want to highlight. Since the cycles last roughly 2.1 years, the Mars-Sun conjunctions shift with each successive iteration, and usually they shift by 1 sign, but occasionally it will move by 2 signs. So like the one 2 cycles ago that started in Libra, it started in Libra. The subsequent one that we're in right now began in Scorpio, but with the subsequent one after this being in Capricorn, it's just skipping Sagittarius entirely, again because of Mars' sort of eccentricity. And then I want to cover just the retrograde, since we do have the retrograde impending now. And I think, as most of you know, a retrograde is sort of an optical illusion created by the appearance of a planet seeming to move backwards through the zodiac. Mars's in particular can last, it's not, regularly predictable, like Mercury's, which lasts roughly 3 weeks, but Mars's can last anywhere from 58 to 81 days, which is a pretty wide range. This one will last 80 days, so it's on the longer side. And if you were to watch the shape made by Mars in the sky over the course of its walking backwards, it seems to trace a zigzag or a loop-the-loop through the sky. And there's a line in Valens that seems to suggest that this is Mars, so to speak, at its most martial, because in the anthology, when listing Mars's significations, Valens says that Mars rules anapodismo or anapodismo. I don't know the exact pronunciation, but that's the technical term that Hellenistic astrologers used to describe retrogrades, which literally means walking backwards. So there seems to be this suggestion on the part of Valens that Mars partakes, or like all retrogrades partake in the nature of Mars, in that they bring stress. They indicate like the planet is going against the grain. It's going against sort of the prevailing dominant motion, right? Mars is about separation, and it seems to be separating from what the rest of the sky is doing at that given moment. And that's like sort of a naturally martial, especially Mars and Aries action, right? To stride out on one's own, to carve out one's own sort of corner in the world. Yeah, and also astrology is a science of visibility, and Mars is at its most visible, at its brightest and greatest proximity to Earth during its retrograde, and therefore I think there's a suggestion that Mars is sort of at its strongest, or like most Marsy during that time period, because it is at its loudest. It's like I said, Mars's full moon occurs during that time period. And here is an illustration that shows you again how that optical illusion is created and what that view looks like from Earth. And this was a graphic I found that actually used Mars's 2020 retrograde in Aries to illustrate this process. A few more peculiarities about the opposition. So the opposition occurs when there's the smallest distance between Earth and Mars. So like I said, Mars is at its most visible, but Mars, of all planets, has the greatest variability in terms of its apparent brightness and size. Every 15 or 17 years, these oppositions will occur when Mars is at its closest proximity to the Sun, a state that's called perihelion. They can also fall at aphelion, and that's when Mars is the least visible. But when they happen at perihelion, that is the minimum, smallest possible distance between Mars and the Sun, and therefore it is very incredibly bright. The most recent fell in 2018. The next one will fall in 2035, right? 17 years after that date. And these generally occur when sidereally Mars is in Capricorn or Aquarius. And I think at the end of all this, we can ask like, okay, great. So we understand the cycle, but what does it really mean? And I like how Austin Coppock has referred to Mars' cycle as a campaign. I've also worked in the trades, and I think Mars rules those who work with their hands. There's something about these, like the way a day unfolds at a job site that you can also use to understand these cycles. But generally speaking, it's been my experience that studying these cycles in my life and the lives of others, you find these stories with high points that map to a lot of the moments that I outlined earlier, wherein we find these stories emerging of self-assertion, conflicts, and dedication to causes. There's this seeding that occurs at the conjunction, the new moon moment. When we have the heliacal rise, there's greater glimmers of what is growing or what was started at that time. If you think of like when you sow a seed in the soil, it's not visible what actually is happening until the first shoots, the first leaves poke their heads out of the ground. That's kind of what happens at the heliacal rise. At the waxing square, we encounter challenges and limits to growth, but there's still this sense of being filled with potential. But then I think the greatest number of obstacles occur, the greatest number of challenges once we get the waxing trine and go into the retrograde period. More potentials are collapsing into actualities. There's a sense of the need to make more decisions and choices. And in making decisions and choices, we are literally killing off other possibilities for ourselves. And subsequently at the waning square, then there's a sense of constriction as we've bound ourselves to certain possibilities and foregone others, and therefore must live with the choices we have made. At that point, there's a need to sort of shore up defenses, shore up foundations, and to retreat. But that's basically all I have for Mars's synodic cycle. And at this point, I'd love to turn it over to Jessica.
Cool. All right. I'm going to get my slides up. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. So, all right. I'm going to talk about this specific Mars retrograde. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about definitely sort of naturally folds in all the things that Whitney and Caleb also mentioned. Um, so if you're looking for me online, I'm Dendrolathia at all things on all social media platforms, my email, my website. I also am a former student of Adam Ellenboss, and I am a full-time digital preservation librarian here in Washington, D.C. And going back to Whitney's talk, I have the shit stirring Mars. I have Mars in Gemini. It's in the sixth house. It is my malefic out of sect, but it's rejoicing. It rules my midheaven. It rules both my lot of fortune and my lot of spirit. And it is also the exaltation lord of my first house. So I do love him very much. um, if you're looking for a more thorough, in-depth conversation about this Mars retrograde, I did give a hour-long talk about it for OPA about a month ago. It's free. It's on YouTube. You can go looking for it using this information. I definitely talk about the Mars retrograde cycle much more like esoterically, I would say. The title of the talk was called Mars retrograde in Leo and Cancer, Architectures for the Exorcised. So it's just a much more detailed look at this. For the sake of time, I'm going to try to cover the same information that I talk about in that talk, but in about 20 minutes. And I'm just going to be covering what I think is most notable about this Mars retrograde. And hopefully I'll be able to convey what I think is of most practical utility for individual people who are, at least somewhat familiar with astrology or familiar with their own charts, and trying to anticipate what this Mars retrograde will be about for them individually. And like the other two speakers have mentioned, I describe Mars retrogrades, they're threshold experiences. Mars retrogrades really perpetuate us from major planetary cycles, major turning points within our lives. I think across the board, most people are familiar with the fact that 2026 is going to be a big deal. Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, everybody changing signs. There's a lot kind of embedded into this Mars retrograde cycle that is perpetuating us towards a really massive transition. And a lot of these things also kind of situate us within these greater cycles of other superior planet cycles like Jupiter and Saturn cycles. So in general, when we're coming upon a Mars retrograde, in my opinion, it's not just specific to what's happening in Cancer right now, what's happening in Leo right now, but it's also going to be about what happened at the last Mars cazimi, what's going to happen at the next Mars cazimi, what happened 2 years ago, what's going to happen 2 years from now. Mars really forces you through these transition threshold spaces. And going off of what Caleb was saying about the Mars synodic cycle, the Mars retrogrades do begin with that initial trine to the sun. So already it should be on everyone's mind because we just had the most recent the Sun Mars trine with the Sun in Sagittarius and Mars in Leo. The house topics of Sagittarius and Leo are kind of where our Mars retrograde story begins. Then we'll have a culmination of that campaign, perhaps, or that story, perhaps, or that project that will culminate as a Capricorn Cancer story. And then it's ultimately going to end with a bit of a Sun Mars trine with the storyline between Pisces and Cancer again. So you can kind of think about it in those three kind of chunks in terms of how it initiates, how it culminates, how it ends. And as both Whitney and Caleb mentioned, the entirety of this Mars retrograde cycle, it is going to be exploring how specifically the house topics of Aries and Scorpio play out across that whole campaign storyline. So when we're thinking about Sagittarius and Leo topics, we're still thinking about them as they pertain to the house topics of our Aries and Scorpio houses. Same goes for the Capricorn Cancer topics. How do those pertain to the topics of Aries and Scorpio in our houses, and so forth? So when you think about what is Mars doing, Mars is always going to be asserting the house topics of Aries and Scorpio, wherever it's at, just within a set of contexts that are specific to the house it's transiting. And in general, in addition to those Aries and Scorpio house topics, Mars is always going to be carrying its natural significations that Whitney talked about at length, things including drive, will, force. I also think of Mars as being very intimately connected to the topic of sacrifice, labor, strife, decision, separation, all of those sort of things. Yeah. So, and I also really love this Mars retrograde cycle because its storyline, in my opinion, is really cohesive. Like the narrative really flows. It has a good track record. It has a lot of pivot points that we can point to before we get to now to kind of look back on why we're here. Why are we doing, like, what is the utility of this Mars retrograde? What's it for, in a way? A lot of what's going on right now with where Mars is going to station and what it's going to do in Leo and Cancer, it kind of harkens back to prior Mars experiences. One of them would have been the last Mars retrograde, the Mars retrograde that we had in Gemini, which was October 30th, 2022 through January 12th of 2023. There's ways in which the Mars retrograde topics that came up even during that retrograde cycle that were specific to the Gemini parts of our chart, some of that isn't gone. Like there's still a bit of like a resonance of those Gemini topics, things that are still playing out, things that are still at play, ways that retrograde cycle still is impacting our lives. And some of that has to do with the fact that Jupiter is in Gemini now. So, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more too, because I think that Jupiter in Gemini actually really flavors this retrograde cycle quite heavily. So you can think about that to a certain extent. You can also think about the Venus and Leo retrograde that we had last summer. That was from July 22nd through September 3rd of last year. That is pertinent simply because Venus retrograded in Leo. Now Mars is going to retrograde in Leo. Some of those topics aren't completely tied up. They aren't completely done. There's a way in which some of the acute sense of lack that a Venus retrograde can bring about, now Mars kind of comes into Leo, and it's a little bit less about this guttural sense of lack and more about this kind of externalization of how I will go about those things, how I will go about attaining those things. There's action. There's an action orientedness to the house topics of Leo, whereas a Venus retrograde is not particularly action forward. It's more, there's more of an acute awareness of what's not coming to us. So there's a bit of a play going on between what happened last year and what's happening now with Leo. We also, as Caleb mentioned, we had the Mars Cazimi in Scorpio last year. So that could have, I think in a subtle way, that would have been quite subtle, but you might be able to look back at that November timeframe and get a sense of how is Mars being reborn, just Mars topics in general for you in your life. How did you reassert or reattain a new agenda for Mars around that time? Because that's ultimately what a Cazimi is kind of doing. It's inseminating Mars with a new direction or a new sense of divine authority or inspiration towards something. And just as Caleb also mentioned, you can look back to the heliacal rise back in January, which was like January 9th, 10th, 11th or so. But that heliacal rise often comes with a bit of like an announcement about Mars topics. Like when Mars becomes visible, it's like heralding in the new platform for Mars in a way. And it might, for some people, have just simply been a time where you felt more invigorated. It might have been getting your energy back, especially with Mars having been in Capricorn. There was a lot of just like initiatory industrialness with Mars at that time. And this is something that I'll touch on a bit more throughout my section of this talk a few more times, but we've also been having these Aries eclipses. So we've already been having a Mars ruled part of our chart pretty activated through that eclipse cycle, most acutely on the Aries solar eclipse that happened on Chiron this past April. So it's already been present. What Mars ruled parts of our chart have been going through an overhaul of some kind, or having some kind of cataclysmic or even cathartic major pivot points being transfigurated in some way, shape, or form. And that's the context of that aspect of our lives being changed and overhauled, that's playing out in the Cancer and Leo parts of our chart for sure. There's something about a pause that has to happen in the Leo and Cancer parts of our charts, that lack of action or that inaction or that revision of how we're going to go about action in those two houses that is perpetuating the ultimate outcome of those Aries eclipses. One way I'll think about the retrograde cycle is there's a lot that builds tension, and that is a martial aspect. Like, tension is Mars. There's a couple faces, like Whitney mentioned. There's the tension with Mars, and there's also like blunt force with Mars. And I tend to think of the time period leading up to a Mars retrograde or leading up to the Mars station as the things that are building the tension. And I feel as if you can intuit that tension, you can feel that tension. In my opinion, the transits that are most significant to consider as what were the tension builders would have been looking back at the Cancer new moon. The reason why that was so significant is because the Cancer full moon will be at the culmination point of the Mars-Sun opposition. So the Cancer new moon and the Cancer full moon are very intimately connected to the time at which Mars is going to be closest and brightest to the Earth, the time at which Mars is going to be the most martial during this retrograde. Plus, that Cancer new moon had some other peculiarities about it. At the moment of that Cancer new moon, both Venus and Jupiter were in Intisha with one another. And also Mercury happened to be at about 6 Leo, which is the degree at which Mars is going to retrograde. So there were things already at play on that Cancer new moon that probably would have been very quiet or subtle because it's a new moon, it's a dark moon, it's Cancer, it's a mute sign. But it would have been like the context would have been there. We would have been able to look back in hindsight and kind of feel like, okay, yeah, my Cancer part of my chart was doing this. It did pertain to the Aries part of my chart in this way. I can kind of see how both Gemini and Leo had some things to say at the time in regards to Cancer topics and maybe even Mars topics. Then Mars entered Cancer in early September, and that would have really started, pulling in specifically the Mars and Cancer components of this retrograde cycle, the themes at play. Then we would have had a Jupiter-Mars antition at September 22nd. And I'll talk a bit more about the importance of the antisha in some future slides. But for now, just kind of think about antisha as two planets that are working towards the same means and ends and understand one another, even though the direct association between the two isn't hyper present. It's not totally clear, but they understand one another. They're doing the same thing. So at that point in time, Jupiter and Mars topics, totally on the same page. Gemini and Cancer topics, doing the same thing. And that's going to happen a few more times. Then Mars entered shadow on October 5th. Then we had recently a Mars-Pluto opposition, and we're going to have a couple more of those. But that first one was in Cancer Capricorn, so that will be the last Cancer Capricorn Mars-Pluto opposition that we have. And then ultimately, Mars entered Leo on November 4th as well. So I'm talking about two special features about this Mars retrograde that I think are unique to this retrograde in particular. One of them is that Jupiter and Gemini that I've talked about already a bit. I think in a lot of ways, the house of Gemini and the house topics of Gemini, the things that Gemini rules in our charts, are actually they're really dictating a lot about this Mars retrograde in a way that might not be obvious to right away. The reason for that being is that Jupiter is the exaltation lord of Cancer. So at the moment, Mars is not in Cancer. But when Mars does go back into Cancer, where Jupiter is at any point in time when there's a planet in Cancer, Jupiter is setting context for it. Jupiter, as the exaltation lord of Cancer, is saying, hey, this Gemini thing, the reason why you're doing that Cancer thing is because of this Gemini thing. or the underlying motivation for this Mars thing in Cancer, Gemini house. That it sets a lot of tone, it sets a lot of importance, sets a lot of context. And then I've also mentioned how there's that Antisha relationship between Cancer and Gemini. I won't go into like a full explanation of Antisha exactly, but it is that time when planets are in Antisha with one another. It means that they have equal distance of time from the summer solstice. So the summer solstice happens at the first degree of Cancer, symbolically speaking. So as you go out in the zodiac, as you go towards Leo and towards Gemini, you're getting equal amounts of light and day. So whenever those degrees add up equally across those signs, it says, it's often it's delineated as those two planets being in agreement, or they're being beneficial to one another. They understand one another. They have equal power. They have sympathy. I also like to think of them as having the same divine knowledge, or they have the same spiritual intent. They're going towards the same purposes. There's also this idea that there's almost a shadow quality because they have the same amount of like shadow of light as well. So sometimes you do get connotations of there being secrecy or there being things that are hidden about an Antisha. I think that that's possible for some people, for that secretness or hiddenness, or under the tableness perhaps, or unspokenness to come into play. But by and large, I think you'll see it show up as simply those two planets being in agreement, or those two houses being in agreement. The other special feature is as I think Neptune and Pisces, actually. If you go back, or if you think back to where I started this talk, I mentioned that the last Sun Mars trine that we have is going to be from Pisces to Cancer. And Neptune and Pisces, I think very subtly is at play here, but it is at play. We're going to get 3 trines of Mars to Neptune. Both, we'll have 2 during the Mars Cancer transits, and then we'll have one final one after the retrograde is over next spring. But these are also, I think, important things to consider and bring up, and perhaps the Pisces topics of our charts might not be super obvious, but there is this kind of like Neptune presence at play with some of this as well, and specifically Neptune trines. And this is something that I talk about in more depth in the talk that I gave last month. But I think the combination of the influence of Neptune and Jupiter influencing this Mars retrograde, and also the fact that this Mars retrograde is going to be a bit of a transition from what's been Aries North Node eclipses to then Pisces North Node eclipses. Something I talk about is how I think of this as being very symbolic of what's called meaning reconstruction models. This is something that's talked about a lot in our approaches to grief and academic studies around grief. I cite one article here that I think is a good like authoritative text on meaning reconstruction models that talks about how it's a constructivist model that helps people understand how to adapt to bereavement and making meaning of loss. And I think about with Mars having the capacity to be so destructive, especially as Mars retrogrades in Cancer, which is symbolically Cancer is the rising sign of the Thema Mundi. Cancer is where everything originates from. It is the vast ocean. It is a symbolic mother. It is the beginning and source of all things. For there to be a consideration of challenge or strife to that as a concept, with Neptune and Jupiter in the mix, there is going to be some adaptation to bereavement. There is going to have to, some of this is also trying to make sense of things that are seemingly sacrificial or seemingly destructive for the sake of it, but not really. And one of the quotes that I liked from this article talks about how rather than being viewed as a primarily emotional individual process, grief is increasingly being seen as a process in which important cognitive, social, and existential adjustment occurs. Mourners struggle not only with the absence of their loved one and a corresponding flood of emotion, but with this bewildering sense of meaninglessness. And that can often be like what Mars retrogrades are about. It's like sometimes there's just this why to it all. Like this is like unnecessary. Um, like if you envision the oddity that is the Mars ecliptic cycle and things like that, the randomness to it, or the seemed pure raw rebellion that Mars can kind of be, against going against the grind for the sake of it. When we have Jupiter and Neptune influencing this Mars retrograde, and also that transition from Aries to Pisces eclipses, I think that there is going to be an opportunity for a lot of people to actually find that this isn't meaninglessness. Even if there's a lot of pain or a lot of bereavement that has to take place. So yeah, so this is going back to the tension building. And then this is, as I mentioned, I think there's two sides of Mars, the other side being the blunt force. And the blunt force, I think, comes when Mars does actually station retrograde. Um, the Mars station moment happens at 6 degrees Leo. I encourage everyone to just put it in your back pocket or put it on your calendar or in your diary or whatever, that we are going to have a significant transit at 6 degrees Leo, July 29th of 2026. We have a Jupiter Cazimi on a full moon opposite Pluto. So there's a lot of reasons that this 2024 time period, I do believe, corresponds directly to a heightened event in that July period, which is another reason why I'm thinking about this being a transition toward, like a transition step with this retrograde. But for now, just to situate us in the now and the present, we will have a Mars-Pluto opposition, a month after that retrograde station. We'll have that first or that second Cancer-Mars trine, second week of July or second week of January. And then, as I mentioned, we get that Cancer full moon, which will be that culminating point, both the culmination of the Mars retrograde, because it's the Mars-Sun opposition, but it's also going to be the culmination of what happened on that Cancer new moon back in July. So I do think that the blunt force moment of the actual retrograde station, after Mars kind of has a little bit of like an adjustment period, or we get kind of grounded in what's going on, or we get our senses together a bit, by the time we get that January 12th Mars Neptune trine, and then we get that Cancer full moon, I think across the board in general, I think people will have a sense of, okay, how I'm going to handle this, how I'm going to face this, where I'm going to lean in, where I'm not going to lean in, where I might choose inaction, where I might simply offer up my vulnerability if I want to, especially with that Neptune Mars trine. I think, and Mars being in a water sign, and in Cancer in particular, some of this is also about how do I go forward with my vulnerability? Like, how do I confront somebody by actually leaning into where I'm vulnerable, or leaning into the honesty of my vulnerability? Some of that is going to be at play a little bit. And then I think what will be really beneficial for most people is going to be this moment when Jupiter stations direct in early February. Jupiter stations direct at 11 degrees, and often what can sometimes happen when a planet stations direct for the last time in a sign before the next sign it enters, which is what's happening here, we can sometimes, at least intuitively, if not even materially, see ways in which Jupiter's ingress into the next sign starts to play up or kick up a little bit. So we might already be getting a sense of what Jupiter in Cancer will be like, which gives us back a sense of faith, gives us a sense of control a little bit. At least things start to make sense. Like, that ought to be the moment where the meaning reconstruction kind of starts to take place. And shortly thereafter, Mars does station direct again, at the end of February. Real fast highlights about just the topics and themes of this stuff. As long as Mars is in Leo, we're talking bestial topics. Um, we're talking about, in my opinion, like the revealing and releasing of inherent violence as restorative force, as restitution. There's a lot of focused energy around what has integrity. Integrity as in things that are whole. We think about our own integrity, like my individual integrity, but integrity is something that anything has when it's whole. It doesn't have decompartmentalization. It doesn't have inconsistency, those sort of things. So there's a fight for making something whole or having integralness to it, which has truth, convictions, and it will expose things that lack that or don't allow for wholeness. Some of this is like with the bestial aspect of it too. It's screaming to fill a void. Voids are opportunities for they're holes. They're things that are not whole. So there's a play on like spatial volatility going on, courageous confrontation, combating cruelty. There's also going to be exposures of like megalomania, autocracy, absolutionism, grandiosity, like all of those sort of like leonine, dark side quality kind of things. And when this is also going to be like taking action when words fail, like thinking about like the animalistic nature of Mars when we don't talk, we just do in a way. On the flip side, when Mars moves back into Cancer, very different. It's Mars moves into mute sign. And mute signs, there's going to be an emphasis on somatic responses and also somatic cures. We can think about the felt sense of anxiety in the body with Mars, but also the importance of simply taking baths, even doing sound baths. With something I think about, like things that are quote unquote like psychosomatic, they're not unreal, they're not perceived, they're not false experiences, but the cure to somatic things is also to do somatic things, to have it move through you. We're also going to be thinking about like leaning into vulnerability or confronting the exploitation of vulnerability. That means thinking about memory and nostalgia, but also the manipulation of memory and nostalgia. Things around grief and intimacy, things that are familial, but potentially tribal, yearning, sentimentality, children, mothers, caretakers, dependents. I also think it might be possible that memorialization comes up as a topic, and also the corruption of memorials, or what it could look like if a memorial was corrupt, perhaps. Things around like forgotten devourments, like Mars is like Cancer is like how we eat, how we nourish. We might be revisiting or remembering a hunger, like a desirous hunger that we used to have, a need for nurturing our grief. Silent desire maneuvers like the fragility or resiliency of grand illusions and disillusionments around faith, sound barriers, literally or figuratively, hypersensitivity and hypervigilance, things around restorative and reconstruction practices too. Also, just like Cancer being things that are interior to us, they're interior spaces. It's about like the confluence between the self and others. As I mentioned before, Cancer being the beginning of the thema mundi, the idea around like the extent of a cultural record, perhaps, or like cultural records being compromised. I think about things like the symbolism of tomb raiding, or like a river valley being contaminated, like things being attacked at the source with Cancer. Another thing too, with Mars and Cancer that came to mind, someone who I think is a really great author to read anytime we're talking about Mars topics is René Girard. He's a French historian, philosopher. He's Aries rising with both malefics and Scorpio in the eighth house. But there's from one of his works, he talks about like the sacralizing of oneself to make oneself godlike. There being a contrastment of egotism and altruism. He talks about things around like what is quote unquote noble conduct and the role of ritualized desire, or having quote unquote like victim unity. And in one of his works, he also explores the topicality of expiatory and propitiatory aspects of sacrifice. And I think that will come up, especially with those Cancer, Mars, Neptune trines. Expiatory sacrifice might look like atonement. It might look like redemption, but propitiatory sacrifice looks more like doing something to appease somebody. It might be conciliatory action, or pacifying action. And I think that with those Mars Neptune trines and Jupiter and Gemini, we'll see both the most quote unquote noble altruistic expressions of either of those types of sacrifice, but also the potential for the exploitation of like a ritualized portrayal of sacrifice that is actually egotism at play, perhaps. So ultimately, when Mars does station direct, it's important to note that it immediately forms the antitia with Jupiter, pretty much, like the very next day. So those topics between Cancer and Gemini, they become merged. They marry somehow. They come together almost immediately. So there's closure in some capacity at the end of this Mars retrograde. We do get that last Mars Neptune trine in April. We get the final Mars Pluto opposition. Mars doesn't leave the shadow of its retrograde, doesn't get past that 6-degree Leo point all the way until May. And then a month later, Jupiter enters Cancer. And in some ways, I think it's perfectly fine to anticipate that what Mars may be stalled or challenged in its time in Cancer, Jupiter will bring some healing or some change or some reconciliation of that strife once it ingresses. And then real briefly, if you want to think about what's next to come for Mars, I would look to the next Mars cazimi, which is going to be in Capricorn. Its heliacal rise happens on the Pisces lunar eclipse. So that's also how I know that these Pisces Virgo eclipse is coming up. The Mars retrograde kind of folds right into them in a way. And as I mentioned before, I would also keep an eye out for that Jupiter cazimi at 6 Leo, because I think that this story doesn't end really. I think it picks up again 2 years from now. Yeah, so this just really recaps everything. I know that we're kind of closing up on time, but you can kind of defer to these slides and just keep in mind that we begin with that Sagittarius Leo trine, we end with that Pisces Cancer trine. And I think that that's actually helpful to revisit throughout the progress of Mars in this retrograde. That's all I got. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica and Caleb. We've got some time now for questions. If anybody had some and you want to drop them in the chat, or I think you can use the hand raise option. We've got a question in the chat from Lauren. Do you think there's any significance to Mars having its heliacal rise at Saturn's direct station degree?
I would say yes.
I'm like, generally whenever we see things like that, I say yes as well. It's kind of like the concept with eclipses where like there's an eclipse at a degree and then everything that hits that degree for however long afterward, depending on the modality of that eclipse, we see something spark up. So yeah, I'd agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, similarly agreed. It is interesting how like there's this process of like different events clouding, occluding, or creating chaos in different parts of our charts, and then similar forces coming in to clean up, like you were highlighting about Jupiter. That's how I thought of like Jupiter in Taurus was like cleaning up Taurus after all the eclipses on the Scorpio Taurus axis, for instance, So having similarly like Mars make its heliacal rise where Saturn station direct in Pisces. Yeah, that's going to be a similarly prickly drilling down and a bringing to bear of like what's important in that house, like to the foreground.
Yeah, and one major, which I didn't get into in my piece, but another thing that I think is worth considering is at the end of March and into April, after Mars has already gone direct, we are going to have some exact trines between exalted Venus, Saturn in Pisces, the North Node in Pisces, Neptune right at the end and beginning of Pisces and Aries. They're all going to be exactly trine Mars in Cancer, and all of that is also sextile Uranus. So there's going to be we're in for Saturn and Mars to have major agreements that are also like Uranianly divine in some capacity coming up. Just before the Venus and Aries retrograde. So or in the midst of that Venus and Aries retrograde, which is the exaltation lord of Pisces, which is why that's important. So yeah, there's a lot of like hope, I think, next spring, mixed with um just like raw um like resignation to it, I think. I think it's a combination of hope and resignation, but
Mm.
like in this like YOLO way.
Yeah, like with those, the Mercury and Venus retrogrades upcoming in March and then stretching into April, with them like straddling the boundary between Aries and Pisces, they'll be like pinging all those processes in a really intimate way. But it is interesting that even once Mars stations direct, it's stewarding everything that happens in Aries all throughout March, carrying on into April, and then May as well when Saturn enters Aries too, you know?
Well, and then we have that kind of like double benefic or not benefic, double malefic kind of influence where it's like, okay, how do we use that to kind of push through anything that might be coming up as we're like looking at how this cycle echoes, as Jessica said in 2026. We've got another question in the chat from Karen. Hearing that Mars's elliptical path is heavily influenced by the gravitational pull of Jupiter made me wonder, how do you see the symbolic meaning of Mars's behavior being fundamentally shaped by Jupiter? I'm going to pitch that one to Caleb to start with.
Yeah. I think in general, it's fascinating how, gravitationally speaking, Jupiter acts as this like counterweight in our solar system to the massive gravitational pull of the sun. And insofar as like the sun being emblematic of centrality, self sovereignty, the clear and solitary knowing of the individual, its connection to vision, that is then counterposed by Jupiter, which is, being the greater benefic and having such interest in that which unifies, coheres, but enfolds things in greater wholes, right? I think there's something about, especially Pisces and Sagittarius being spaces wherein we are connected to things outside of ourselves, right? Jupiter, I think, can offer noble ends for martial energies rather than, there is value in Mars being more solar in its approach, in fighting for oneself, in carving out one's niche in the world, in connecting with one's drive, one's will to power, and so on. But also, like, that way of living can lead one to a lot of loneliness, right? And so if it's not tempered by Jupiterian ethic, by Jupiterian nobility, by Jupiterian philosophy, then I think that in that way Jupiter can temper or ennoble, Mars's energies. Like you were saying, Whitney, like you'd rather use your own Jupiter, right, to counterpose or counteract Mars than Venus. I think I similarly take that approach in my own life. But that's also due to how my own chart is set up too,
Yeah, definitely. And I think it has to do, like if we're talking natally, I think it's going to have to do with how strong Mars is in your chart. It might need that kind of overweighting influence of Jupiter to kind of bring it into line. One of you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking it's Valens who says one of the connections between like Mars and Jupiter, if they're aspecting each other, is the person becomes a master of life and death, which is not necessarily like you're an executioner, but it is somebody who has a lot of power over others. So as I'm thinking about Jupiter shaping that, martial behavior, I'm thinking of how it's being kind of elevated and expanded from, this single warrior to potentially an army, or, the power that a group has in acting over the power of a single individual. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and just a real small tidbit. A few years back, I went through and put together like a visualization of where Mars has the most essential dignity, like for every sign and every degree. And actually, like Pisces is like across the board, where Mars is the strongest, like statistically speaking. Even if it has like exaltation in Capricorn and so forth, like Pisces is the only place where it will have like term and decan and everything else. So there's definitely a inherent relationship between Jupiter and Mars.
I'm just going to see if anybody has their hands up. I don't see any hands up. Any last questions? I think we've got time for maybe one more. And then one more from Lauren. One of Caleb's slides had a small disclaimer on the bottom right. I think it was the slide that showed how the optical illusion of retrogrades is created. The note said retrogrades can't affect human affairs. What does that mean exactly, and why?
I did not notice that, but considering a lot of the illustrations I grabbed were from the websites of astronomical nerds, not astrologers, I'm guessing it's the astronomers trying to distance themselves from what we do. Like I think that graphic in particular is from like a video on an astronomer's YouTube channel where he starts by talking about Mercury retrograde before talking about Mars retrograde, and the impetus is to be like, you don't need to stress about Mercury retrograde. Screw these astrologers, blah blah blah, you know? Yeah. Yeah.
That's always the tricky part, is because I think you do need the astronomy to be a truly good astrologer, but that kind of resistance from the astronomical community can be a bit of a challenge. So yeah, that's always an interesting one. Okay, so it looks like we are slightly over time. Again, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Caleb, for your great presentations. Thank you so much to our audience. We loved having you here. Appreciate your questions. The recording will be out within the next week, probably less than that, because I will begin working on it basically immediately. So keep an eye on your email inbox. If you aren't already following us on social media, make sure you do that so you can see when we've actually gone and sent out that recording. So once again, thank you, and best of luck. May the odds be in your favor. All of that stuff as Mars stations retrograde. See you guys later.